The desert wind howled like a wounded beast, clawing at the walls of the city with hot, dry fingers. Layla al-Hakim tightened her scarf, eyes squinting against the burning sand as she watched the sun sink in blood-red streaks behind ancient dunes. London felt like another lifetime. Here, the air was a promise and a threat all at once, scented with spices and secrets, heavy with the weight of history. She felt it pressing on her chest with cruel familiarity, reminding her she no longer belonged. Every whisper on the street carried her family's shame. Every closed door was a verdict. But she'd run out of choices the moment her father died, leaving nothing but debts and disgrace behind. Inside her head, she repeated her plan over and over, a fragile mantra to hold her together. She would see him once. Beg. Make him understand. But as she approached the vast expanse of his private oasis, palms swaying, torches burning like watchful eyes, her courage crumbled. It wasn't the guards with their curved swords, or the hush of servants who refused to meet her gaze. It was the knowledge that she was walking willingly into the jaws of a predator. Rumor said Sheikh Khalid ibn Rashid could ruin a man with a single word. That he smiled while gutting competitors. They ushered her into his grand tent, where the ceiling rose like a cathedral of woven gold and silk. The scent of oud clung to the air, musky and hypnotic, curling around her resolve. Khalid sat on a throne of cushions, legs crossed, back relaxed, eyes fixed on her with a silence that cut deeper than any insult. She swallowed hard, fingers twisting in her skirt. He made no move to stand or greet her. It was a game. A test. She felt her skin prickle, rage battling humiliation. But she refused to look away, refusing to show weakness even as her heart thundered in her chest. Layla al-Hakim, he drawled finally, voice low and textured like velvet over steel. She bristled at the way he said her name, tasting every syllable like a threat. She fought the tremor in her voice. Sheikh Khalid. Thank you for seeing me. He gave a humorless chuckle. I didn't do it for charity. The words sliced at her pride. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She felt her nails biting her palms as she clenched her fists. She had to hold it together. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to survive. He lifted a hand, a lazy command for her to sit. The servant poured tea with trembling precision. She perched on the edge of the cushion like a bird trapped in a cage. He watched every twitch, every breath, his eyes as dark and merciless as the desert night. Do you know why you're here? He asked finally, voice silk over stone. She swallowed. Pride almost gagged her. To ask for your help. He tilted his head, eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Ask, he echoed, savoring the word. She felt heat rise to her face, part rage, part shame. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. You don't ask, Layla. You beg. The word slapped her. Her breath caught in her throat, tears stung her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. Her voice cracked anyway. Please. I have no one else. He smiled, and it was cold. Predatory. Good. Now we understand each other. She wanted to scream. Instead, she held his gaze with the fury of the betrayed. He seemed to relish it, sipping tea as if her pain were the finest spice. You see, he continued, his tone maddeningly conversational, I don't make deals with beggars. Her heart plunged, the world spinning in dizzying dread. But, he added, eyes narrowing in calculated thought, I make deals with wives. Her mouth went dry. The silence roared in her ears. She could barely force the word out. Marriage? He laughed once, short and sharp, like a scimitar leaving its sheath. Don't flatter yourself. Not marriage. A contract. She felt as though the tent itself shifted around her, closing in. Her fingers clawed at the cushion beneath her. What kind of contract? She asked, voice ragged. He held her gaze, unwavering. You will give me an heir. He said it simply, as though it were a trade for livestock, or land, or oil rights. Her stomach twisted. She tried to speak, but only a broken gasp escaped. He waited. Patient. Merciless. He elaborated with cool, practiced precision. You will give me a child. My child. In return, I will pay your father's debts. Restore your family's standing. Ensure no one in Zeran dares speak your name with shame again. His voice dropped to a whisper, dangerous and intimate. It's a generous offer. She felt bile rise in her throat. Generous. He was buying her womb. Her legacy. Her body. She wanted to spit at him, slap him, run. But her legs wouldn't move. The silence between them felt like a chasm she could fall into forever. Outside, wind rattled the walls of the tent, sounding like the wail of mourning women. She thought of her father's cold grave, the creditors circling like vultures, the shame that stained her name. She saw children in the street avoiding her eyes. Layla al-Hakim, cursed, ruined. She forced herself to look at Khalid, hatred and desperation warring in her chest. She saw no pity in him. Only calculation. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct in her body screamed it. But when she opened her mouth, the words were dust. She saw her family's ruin, the girls who would starve, the elders who would die unnamed. She felt tears threaten again. She wiped them away with furious pride. He watched, unblinking. Unmoved. He didn't flinch at her brokenness. He expected it. Maybe he wanted it. She felt like prey, cornered, panting, heart wild. Khalid's expression never changed. Not a flicker of sympathy. Well, he asked softly, leaning back like a man completely at ease. She hated the way her voice cracked. And if I refuse? He shrugged, as if discussing the weather. Then you will watch everything you care for burn. It makes no difference to me. She felt her fingers tremble against her skirt. His words were casual, but they struck like arrows. She tried to summon her anger as armor, but it collapsed around her. In that moment she saw him clearly. Not the polished magnate in his bespoke suits. Not the sheikh in embroidered robes. But the man who held power like a knife to people's throats. Who believed compromise was weakness. She wondered what had made him that way. She wondered if there was anything left in him that could be touched. But the question died before she asked. Because she saw in his eyes that he wouldn't let himself be touched. Her breath hitched. She closed her eyes. What would it involve? She asked hoarsely, already knowing. Already damning herself for asking. He smiled then, a small victory curling his lips. Submission. Obedience. Loyalty. He paused, letting it sink in like poison. And a child. She felt the last of her pride crack like thin glass. She clenched her jaw so tight it hurt. The wind outside moaned like it was grieving for her. The smell of incense was suffocating, heavy and cloying. It coated her throat, her lungs, made her want to gag. She heard the servants outside shuffle nervously. They knew. Of course they did. Word would spread like wildfire. Layla al-Hakim selling herself to the devil to save her family. She bit her lip until it bled. She tasted copper and shame. He watched, dark eyes glittering, saying nothing. She wished he'd spit on her. Hit her. Anything but this calm, surgical cruelty. She remembered her father's voice, telling her to be strong, to be proud. She wanted to scream at the memory. What good was pride when there was nothing left? She felt her whole life narrowing to this single moment, this single choice. The weight of generations pressing her shoulders down. She let out a broken laugh, so bitter it hurt. His eyes flickered, but only for an instant. Then they went hard again. Impassive. Waiting. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. She wiped them away roughly, refusing to let them fall. She forced herself to meet his gaze. And if I say yes, she rasped. He lifted an eyebrow, expression unreadable. Then I save your family. I wipe your debts clean. I give you back your name. She felt sick. She felt like screaming. But all she did was nod, slow and broken. His face didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened with something that might have been satisfaction. The silence stretched, oppressive, intimate in its cruelty. She couldn't look away. Couldn't breathe properly. Finally, he spoke, voice so quiet it was a caress and a threat at once. Say it. She swallowed hard. Her mouth felt like sandpaper. I accept. It wasn't even a whisper. It was a confession. He nodded once, decisive, sealing her fate. She felt the last of her freedom curl up and die inside her chest. He poured her tea as if they'd simply finished haggling over camels. She stared at the cup, unblinking, hating him with a purity that almost made her dizzy. But she reached for it anyway. Her hand shook so badly she spilled it on her dress. He watched, silent, assessing. She wiped it away, biting back a sob. Outside, the wind fell silent, as if the desert itself held its breath. Inside, the world felt colder than she ever imagined it could. He gestured to the guards without looking at her. Escort my fiancé to the guest quarters. The word burned her ears. Fiancé. As if it were a promise. As if it meant anything but chains. She stood on numb legs, every movement stiff with grief and fury. She didn't look back at him. She wouldn't give him that. But she felt his gaze on her the whole way out, heavy and unblinking, claiming her as his own. She felt something inside her shatter. But she didn't let it show. The desert winds howled outside their fortress of stone as Layla stared at her reflection in the mirror, draped in the heavy gold-threaded gown she despised. She felt like a prisoner, her wrists chafed by invisible shackles of tradition and debt. Khalid had insisted on every ritual, every prayer uttered in the ancient tongue, with no guests to witness but their guards. He hadn't smiled once, his dark eyes cold and unreadable as they signed the contract that passed for marriage. When he kissed her, it was perfunctory, a seal of ownership rather than affection. She felt like livestock purchased at market, her future sold for her family's salvation. She refused to cry in front of him, biting her tongue until she tasted blood. In her heart, she cursed the desert for swallowing her dreams whole. She couldn't believe this was her life now. And yet, she had chosen it. On their wedding night, he didn't touch her beyond what was necessary. He dismissed her curtly, leaving her to sleep alone beneath canopies of silk that felt like a coffin. Layla lay awake for hours, listening to the wind rattle the ornate shutters. Every moment in his palace felt stifling, the marble floors cold against her bare feet. Servants bowed and scurried at his command, but none dared meet her eyes. She was the Sheikh in name alone, with no power save the one he granted her. When he did speak to her, it was with clipped formality, discussing security, schedules, her duty to bear an heir. She longed to hurl the ornate vases at his head. She burned with fury at the man who had reduced her to a broodmare. But she burned for other reasons, too. And she hated herself for that even more. Khalid was a man who knew no compromise. He issued orders like a general, expected immediate obedience, and brooked no defiance. Layla, however, had spent years learning to hold her own in London's cutthroat academia. She wasn't about to bow and scrape like a meek desert wife. Their days were marked by icy silences, formal dinners where the clink of silverware was the only conversation. Sometimes, their fights were quiet, hissing insults traded behind closed doors. Other times they were volcanic, shaking the palace with shouted accusations. He called her ungrateful, reckless, a liability. She called him tyrant, monster, coward. The tension was a living thing between them, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. Yet it was also the only thing that felt real in the suffocating pomp of their life. One night, a sandstorm hit with ferocity, sealing the palace in a shroud of whirling dust. Windows banged like war drums while the torches flickered and died. Layla, already on edge, found herself trapped in the great hall with Khalid. They had nowhere to run from each other or their own resentment. He demanded she show gratitude for his rescue of her family. She spat back that he was no savior, just a man who bought people's lives like camels at auction. His voice was low, deadly, as he called her naive. She screamed that he was heartless. He told her she didn't understand what power required. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment she thought the palace itself might crack. But it was they who broke instead, in the worst possible way. He kissed her. It wasn't tender, wasn't gentle. His hands were rough on her arms, his mouth bruising hers with all the anger he couldn't say. She fought him at first, pounding his chest with her fists, cursing him in Arabic and English alike. But something raw and wounded pulsed between them. She hated him, yes, but she needed him too. When her knees buckled, it wasn't fear that made her tremble. He pressed her against the cool stone wall, biting back his own curses. They were two creatures devouring each other, desperate for a bomb they didn't know how to give. When they broke apart, panting, eyes wild, they didn't speak. Words had always failed them. That night, they let their bodies do the screaming. Afterward, they didn't speak of it. She rose before dawn, washed the sand from her hair, dressed in silence. He was gone from their bed by the time she opened her eyes. Servants whispered in the halls but didn't dare ask questions. Khalid acted as though nothing had happened, discussing trade routes, tribal negotiations, and her medical checkups for fertility. Layla wanted to throw up every time he used the word heir, like it was a commodity. But something in his gaze had changed. It wasn't softer. It was hungrier. He watched her now as though memorizing every expression, waiting for her to slip. And she found herself holding her breath around him, stomach coiling with something that wasn't entirely hatred. One morning, he surprised her by leading her out to the stables. She almost refused, still stinging from the night in the storm. But curiosity got the better of her. He showed her a black stallion bred from his father's prized line. "You will learn to ride," he said simply, as though it were another duty. But when she mounted, he walked beside her, one hand on the reins, correcting her posture with quiet patience. The desert dawn was cool, the sand dunes pink and gold in the rising sun. She felt weightless for the first time in weeks. When she laughed at a joke he made, it startled them both. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw it, a fleeting smile. So rare it was like finding water in the desert. Their truce was uneasy at best. He remained controlling, insisting on security details and schedules that made her bristle. She mocked his constant need for control, calling him, "Your Majesty," with biting sarcasm. He retaliated with barbed comments about her Western education and her foreign ways. Yet at night, they found themselves in the library, arguing over poetry. She'd read him lines in Arabic, her voice trembling with emotion. He'd correct her pronunciation, pretending indifference, but listening to every word. He told her once that the desert didn't forgive weakness. She snapped that it didn't understand love either. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult they'd traded. Khalid was a man who lived with ghosts. Layla could see it in the way he avoided certain corridors of the palace, the old photographs he kept locked away. She once found him at dawn on the balcony, staring at the desert with eyes that held too many regrets. She asked what haunted him, but he turned on her with such fury she backed away in fear. Later, she heard from a servant about his brother, the one who died in an accident Khalid blamed on himself. That guilt was carved into him, making him harsh, unbending. When she confronted him, he warned her never to speak of it again. But the knowledge changed something in her. She still hated him. But she also understood him in a way no one else dared. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a fragile rapport. He commissioned a clinic in her family's village, funded without ceremony. She called him out on his coldness, refusing to thank him like a supplicant. He glared, but didn't deny it was for her. She forced herself to attend the clinic's opening, watching the villagers thank him. He ignored their praise, standing beside her in silence, hand brushing hers only when no one could see. That night, she embroidered a verse from a love poem onto his pillow in Arabic, careful that no servant would see. When he found it, he said nothing. But the next day, he left her a single white rose in her chambers. It was the first gift he'd ever given her. The summer heat was merciless, baking the palace walls until they radiated like a kiln. Layla wiped sweat from her brow, feeling the swell of her belly with both wonder and terror. The physician's words haunted her: high risk, family history of miscarriages, bed rest. She hated being caged indoors, watching the desert through lattice windows like a bird whose wings had been clipped. Khalid had issued orders with military precision. She was not to leave, not to exert herself, not to worry. But worry was all she did. The fear clawed at her chest at night when the wind fell silent. She pressed her palms to her belly, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Outside, the world carried on as always, unmoved by her silent prayers. She felt alone, even with a palace full of people. Especially with him. Khalid's version of care was suffocating. He hired physicians from abroad, demanded weekly reports, posted guards at her doors. When she wept with fear, he didn't hold her. Instead, he stood at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, voice cold as the marble floors. "You will not fail in this," he said once, not realizing those words were knives. She threw a pillow at him, cursing him for his arrogance, for making her body into a battlefield she had no say in. He didn't flinch, just turned and left. That night, she screamed into her pillow until she was hoarse. The next morning he brought her fresh dates from the oasis, laid them silently at her bedside, and walked away without a word. She didn't know if it was guilt or duty. She hated both. The palace was quieter than ever. Servants moved like ghosts, afraid of their master's black moods and their mistress's fragile state. Layla stopped attending meals in the grand hall, eating alone in her chambers while Khalid read reports late into the night. Once, she found him asleep in his study, head resting on maps and contracts. She studied the lines of his face in the candlelight, saw exhaustion carved into him like ancient script. She wanted to wake him, to touch his cheek. Instead, she turned away. They were two people in the same prison, both locked away by duty, fear, and their own unwillingness to bend. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, words they were too proud, or too afraid, to say. When the first pains came early, she screamed so loudly the guards burst in, panic on their faces. The doctor flew in from the next city, arriving on a roaring motorcycle that kicked up clouds of sand. Khalid paced outside her chamber like a caged lion, roaring at anyone who got in his way. Layla clenched her teeth so hard she tasted blood. She hated him for doing this to her, for making her so vulnerable. Between contractions, she gasped insults at him, cursing his ancestors and the entire kingdom. He shouted back that she was a fool for not listening to orders. But his voice cracked at the end, breaking like old pottery. She saw his hands tremble. For a moment, she realized he was just as terrified as she was. The birth was brutal. Hours bled together in a haze of pain and fear. The physician barked orders in 3 languages, sweat pouring off him. Khalid tried to come in twice but was shoved out by the midwife, who swore at him with impressive creativity. Layla felt like she was being ripped in two, sobbing for her mother, for anyone. At one point she cried his name, hating herself for needing him. On the final push, she screamed so loud it echoed through the entire palace. Then there was silence, horrible and absolute, before the baby's cry pierced it like a blade. She sobbed, not sure if it was relief or terror. When they placed the child on her chest, she laughed and wept at once. For a moment, she forgot everything else. Khalid entered slowly, as if afraid he might break the world with his next step. His face was pale, drawn tight with fear. He tried to hide behind that iron mask of command. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at the bundle in her arms like it was made of fire and glass. Layla watched him with exhausted eyes, too drained to hate him, too raw to love him. When she whispered, "He's yours," Khalid shook his head. He knelt at her bedside, something shattering in his dark gaze. His voice cracked. "No," he rasped. "He's ours." She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded, tears slipping down her face. The guards outside pretended they heard nothing. That night, for the first time, Khalid refused to leave. He sat beside her bed in an ornate chair meant for royalty, refusing sleep. Every time the baby cried, he was there first, clumsy but determined. Layla watched him struggle to swaddle the tiny, wailing creature with fingers better suited for a sword hilt. She laughed weakly when he cursed in 3 dialects at the wriggling infant. He glared at her but didn't stop trying. At dawn, when the baby finally fell asleep, Khalid slumped forward, resting his head on the bed by her side. She hesitated, then laid her hand in his hair. He didn't move, didn't speak. But he didn't pull away. Weeks passed in strange, tender silence. Khalid still barked orders at his men, still negotiated trade deals with that cold precision. But with her, something was different. He asked after her health in a voice that shook. He brought her figs and mint tea from the market himself, refusing servants. At night he read poetry to the baby in his gravelly voice, halting over the softer words. Layla watched from the bed, sometimes hiding her smile behind a veil. She felt the fragile threads between them grow stronger, woven through shared exhaustion and wonder. Neither dared speak of love. That word was too big, too dangerous. But it hung between them anyway, waiting for someone to be brave enough to claim it. One afternoon, she found him in the nursery, standing utterly still while their son slept in his crib. He looked like a man at war with himself, hands curled into fists. When she touched his shoulder, he flinched as though burned. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice rough as gravel. "I don't know how to be this." She swallowed the lump in her throat, resting her palm on his back. "Neither do I," she whispered. "But he deserves that we try." He let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob. She turned him to face her and for the first time, kissed him gently. He froze. Then melted. Their tears mingled between them, salt on salt, no longer caring who saw. Rumors spread across the emirate. The Sheikh had changed, they whispered in the souks and caravanserais. The same man who once destroyed rivals with a single word was seen at the oasis, cradling his infant son. He no longer spat orders at every advisor but listened, sometimes. He funded wells in drought-stricken villages, expanded the clinic Layla had begged for. But behind closed doors, he was still himself, stern, quick to anger, painfully proud. Layla refused to let him retreat into coldness, mocking him, teasing him, pulling him back with laughter. When he snarled, she'd kiss him silent. The palace learned to step carefully around their battles, and their reconciliations. Love had made them softer. But not tame. At dusk, Layla often sat by the balcony, watching the desert cool into velvet darkness. The stars emerged like old gods, silent witnesses to her quiet hopes. Khalid would join her there sometimes, dropping heavily onto the cushions with a groan of exhaustion. He never announced himself. He'd just sit, shoulders brushing hers, watching the same sky. Once, she asked him what he saw when he looked at the stars. He hesitated. "Ghosts," he said at last. She didn't press. Instead, she slipped her fingers between his. He squeezed back, hard, like he was afraid she might vanish. They watched the moon rise together in silence, sharing truths too painful to speak. The baby grew quickly, his cries filling the vast halls with life they hadn't known in years. Khalid insisted on choosing his name, arguing tradition demanded it. Layla rolled her eyes but didn't stop him. He named the boy Rashid, after the brother he had lost. When he told her, his voice wavered, betraying an ache that had no words. She cupped his cheek, pressing her lips there in a promise she couldn't quite define. "He'll know who he's named for," she told him. Khalid nodded, swallowing hard. He was a man who ruled with iron, but in that moment, he looked so breakable she could barely stand it. They held each other for a long time, both grieving and healing in the same breath. They fought, of course. Their love was forged in flame, and neither of them knew how to be gentle for long. Layla refused to bow to his commands, challenging him even in front of the council. Khalid would rage, eyes flashing, voice like thunder. But he'd find her afterward, quiet, repentant in his stiff, graceless way. She never let him off easy. "Say it," she'd demand. He'd scowl. "I'm sorry." She'd lift a brow. "For?" He'd huff like an angry bull, then mutter the rest. Their apologies were battles in themselves, hard-won and messy. But they made them. That was the difference. Neither wanted to go back to the silence that had nearly destroyed them. The palace changed around them. Tapestries that had once depicted ancient wars were replaced with intricate scenes of blooming date palms and flowing water. Layla ordered fountains restored, saying their sound brought peace. Khalid pretended to be annoyed at the expense but oversaw every design himself. Servants noticed him smiling more. Children from the village were invited to the gardens to play. At first they were terrified of the Sheikh, but he surprised them with small gifts, falcon feathers and sweets wrapped in gold foil. Layla watched it all with a heart too full to speak. She knew he was trying, every day. She also knew he feared it wouldn't be enough. Late at night, they lay together in a tangle of sheets and old wounds. She traced the scars on his chest, the history written in flesh and blood. He told her stories he'd never told another soul, of battles fought for pride and revenge, of the brother he'd lost on a horse that shouldn't have run that day. She listened, silent, her fingers gentle. When he faltered, voice cracking, she pressed her lips to his ribs, as if kissing the pain away. He would go quiet then, burying his face in her hair. Neither spoke of forgiveness. It was too fragile a word. Instead they held each other like lifelines, refusing to let go even when sleep claimed them. One morning, she woke to find him already up, cradling Rashid in one arm while reading a trade ledger in the other. She laughed, the sound startling them both. He looked up, scowling half-heartedly. "He's heavy," he complained. She only raised an eyebrow. "He's 3 months old." Khalid grunted, shifting the baby carefully. When Rashid grabbed his beard in tiny fists, he cursed softly in Arabic, trying to pry him off without waking the child further. Layla watched, hand over her mouth to stifle more laughter. The great Sheikh of Ziran, brought low by an infant. She loved him in that moment so fiercely it ached. They visited her old village in the spring, traveling with a small caravan under banners of blue and gold. At first, the villagers watched warily, memories of debt and ruin too fresh. Layla walked among them without fear, greeting old women by name, letting children touch her robes. Khalid stood behind her like a silent guardian, dark eyes assessing every threat. But when a boy tumbled and scraped his knee, it was Khalid who crouched, offering a clean cloth and gruff comfort. Layla caught the way the mother stared at him, surprised. She took his hand and squeezed. He didn't look at her, but didn't pull away. Change came slowly, but it came. They slept in a tent that night instead of the old manor, the air filled with the smell of mint and the sound of distant drums. Khalid lay beside her, restless, as if the desert itself refused to let him sleep. She turned to him, fingers tracing the frown on his brow. "You're allowed to be happy," she whispered. He didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rasp. "I don't know how." She kissed him then, slow and deep, their bodies pressed close on the woven rugs. The desert wind rattled the canvas above them, but inside it was warm, lit only by the glow of old oil lamps. They moved together as if nothing else existed. Days turned into weeks, then months. Rashid began to crawl, then to stand, giggling at his own triumphs. Khalid taught him to ride a pony far too early, ignoring Layla's shrieks of protest. He only smirked, saying the boy had to learn courage. She called him a reckless fool, swatting his arm. He caught her hand and kissed her palm, unbothered by the audience of amused servants. At night they read poetry together, their son sprawled asleep between them. Sometimes they argued over verses. Other times they fell silent, letting the words fill the space with aching truth. The palace felt less like a fortress, more like a home. The walls remembered laughter again. And so they lived, imperfect and stubborn, but no longer afraid of the fire between them. Khalid still barked orders that made generals tremble, but he also brushed stray hairs from Layla's face when he thought no one saw. She still challenged him, mocking his arrogance, but she also sewed tiny robes for their growing son with fingers that trembled at the thought of losing any of it. At the oasis, they sat side by side, watching Rashid toddle toward the water. Khalid would lift him high, making the boy squeal with delight, then glance at Layla with a look that said everything he couldn't speak. She'd smile back, fierce and soft all at once. The desert wind carried their laughter far into the night.